certainly have fears that there is a serial killer at loose in Perth.
Sarah Spears, Jane Rimmer, Ciara Glennon.
And every time you saw a young girl walking by, you think, oh God, is she going to be the next victim?
Now, one man stands accused.
If police are right and Edwards is the Claremont serial killer, he's been hiding in plain sight for 20 years.
For the first time, it's been revealed in court Ciara Glennon may have been struck on the back of her head in the moments before her death. Welcome to day 32 of Claremont in Conversation. Natalie Bonjolo in the studio with Alison Fan, and calling in from court is Tim Clark. Now, this is information you're only able to report now after the judge agreed late this afternoon to lift this temporary suppression order that we heard about yesterday.
That's right. And Tim, you were there, but he was hinting quite earlier that he was uncomfortable with this suppression order because he wants to run an open court. He wants justice to be seen to be done, and he did intimate this morning that the collateral, I think, injuries or impact that's done to families during this was not usually a reason to suppress the court or suppress evidence in the court. And after the challenge from our lawyers, that was overturned. Tim, you were there.
Yeah, he was very strong, actually. Now, I've got to say, it's not often judges come out as strongly as Justice Hall did this afternoon. So just to give a bit of context for the listeners, as we discussed yesterday, the suppression order was put in place after an application by the prosecution, which came on the back of some entreaties from the Rimmer and Glennon families. They had been spared the intimate details of the post-mortem for all these years and still wished to be spared from them, and there was also mention of maintaining the dignity of both Miss Rimmer and Miss Glennon. So that was a temporary suppression order that was put on by the judge while he heard this evidence. He said he would listen to it and then he would make a decision when the time was right. In the meantime, as Seven West Media, one of the larger media organisations in Perth, we felt it was we were duty bound somewhat to just let the court know what our feelings were on that, and we did via a letter to the court, which then led to a proposed suppression order that didn't go that far, but would still maintain the dignity of the victims. Our lawyers, the prosecution, the defence, and Justice Hall then got together in court this afternoon and basically thrashed that out. And in that process, Justice Hall reiterated that he was slightly uncomfortable, or certainly uncomfortable with a blanket suppression order, but he was even slightly uncomfortable with some of the terms that had been put forward after negotiations, if you like, between the prosecution and the lawyers representing our company. And so he, in the end, came up with a solution that allayed the main fear and worry of the Glennon and Rimmer family, which related to mentions of their intimate areas. So is the way it was phrased in the suppression order. But then everything else that we'd heard over the past 2 days regarding the post-mortems, we were free to publish, but he also said that the media must keep in mind that they need to do it fairly, accurately, and as sensitively as possible. And so that's where we ended up.
Okay, so in a nutshell now, you've both been sitting in the court for the past 2 days, and now you are able to tell us what you've been listening to for the past couple of days. Can you just talk us through some of that evidence?
Well, yeah, Nat, it's been, as you can imagine, pretty grisly listening at times. Dr Karin Margolius, who performed both post-mortems, who is sadly no longer with us, she passed away. Her reports, initial reports from the crime scene, and then further reports of the post-mortems were read into the evidence by Karin Margolius, the prosecutor, and that took quite a while because, as you can imagine, with two victims, such extensive examinations needed to be done that took a long time. And then since then, we've been hearing from Dr. Clive Cook, who's another pathologist who was present at some of the crime scenes and the post-mortems, worked very closely together with Dr. Margolius, and so was witness to some of the injuries and some of the decomposition of the body, so could give first-hand accounts, but also was able to comment on Dr. Margolius's accounts. And the main takeaway of that, in terms of evidence that we hadn't heard before, was, as you said off the top, Nat, that Dr. Margolius found and concluded that there was a small depressed fracture at the back of Ciara's head that she thinks could have been made with a sharp object, but that she definitely said would have left Ciara stunned, partially semi-conscious maybe, and she also said that fracture was made at or around the time of her death. So what we can conclude from that is that there was some sort of heavy impact to the back of Ciara's head, which would have left her in a very vulnerable position, and even more vulnerable than she was already. And then obviously the wounds that she suffered came at or around the same time.
And both women also, although she did say that with Jane Rimmer too, that both girls suffered defensive wounds on their arms. And we did hear some of this in the prosecution's opening, but yesterday Dr. Clive Cook actually demonstrated how these defensive wounds occur when anybody puts both arms up, like he said a boxer would do. They call it a pugilistic stance, and both the victims had these fairly deep wounds to both arms. Tim, the death of Jane Rimmer was inconclusive, wasn't it?
Yeah, that's right, Ali. So the pathologist's job is multi-layered. Obviously, they're looking for evidence that might be used in a criminal setting or case, but it's also that their job is also to report back to the coroner and to come up with an official cause of death. And in Jane's case, even though she did conclude that there were a significant neck defect visible, despite the length of time that Jane had been exposed to the elements, but because of that and because of the decomposition, that she wasn't able to conclude conclusively that was the actual cause of death. So Jane's cause of death will remain inconclusive or unconfirmed, despite all the evidence we've heard about the defensive wounds, as Ali's mentioned, and this prominent neck injury.
Did Jane Rimmer have a head injury?
Well, once again, Matt, it was really hard to determine that because of the length of time that Jane had been exposed to the elements. And as much as we hate to say it, we are now allowed to say it, there had also been some significant animal predation of the body over the 55 days that she was out there. And so there were other wounds to her which were not, in Dr. Margolius' conclusion, made by a sharp instrument or a bladed instrument, but had been the result of animals. So in terms of a blunt force injury or sharp force injury or any sort of fractures to Jane, that really couldn't be determined because of what had happened to her post-mortem.
In Dr. Margolius's report, she actually said it was impossible to tell whether Jane Rimmer had been strangled because of the state of the body, but she believed there had been no fracture to the skull and no broken bones that I think we'll just sort of not get into the other stuff, but as far as that goes, that's what she said. As far as any fractures went, because of the state of the body, she thought she could tell that.
Yeah. And you both mentioned the defensive wounds, and Alison was, when she was talking about that, she was demonstrating, and if you can just picture, she has both her arms up with her fists clenched in front of her face, just like a boxer. So can you talk to us about what the defensive wounds on the forearms were?
Well, they were long and deep cuts, different arms for both women, but in Jane's case, Dr. Cook described them as classic defensive injuries, and you can imagine if you are being attacked, you would instinctively put your hands in front of your face with your little finger pointing outwards, and that was where both these cuts were noted on both both Jane and Ciara. They stretched, in Ciara's case, from the upper arm right over the elbow to the lower arm. In Jane's case, a little bit less than that, and it was a little bit lower than that, from the forearm to basically the front of the hand to the base of the little finger. And so the similarity there is something the prosecution have pointed to before, and will certainly return to when they come to wrap up the case, and argue that they must have been attacked by the same person.
He said it's actually recognised, didn't he, that it's called a pugilistic boxing position, with both arms up, and he said the wounds were from a sharp object, possibly a knife.
Yeah. I'm just going to cut in and let you know, if you can hear something that sounds like a helicopter buzzing in the background, that's because there is a helicopter buzzing in the background. It's hovering above the building where we're recording, because we're in Western Australia and it's summer at the moment, and there is a bushfire watch and act. So it could be very well that. We're not quite sure because we're sitting in the bunker, but if you are hearing a noise, that's what it is. Now, obviously, you would have also heard about the neck defects, which is how they're being talked about in the courtroom. Can you tell us a little bit about both of those on both of the victims?
Well, these are, certainly in Ciara's case, Dr. Margolius concluded that is what killed her. In Jane's case, it's very likely, or there was a likelihood that was the same, but it couldn't be concluded conclusively. What we can say about both of those is that they were very large, very deep, very significant, and would obviously have been enormously traumatic to go through. Jane's case, it was described at the front of the neck, but stretching out towards the collarbone and then down to just above the breastbone, and that was on the front. And then in Ciara's case, it was there were similar wounds, but at the back of the head, going down. Well, one going down at the back of the head, and then towards the right of her face, and then another horizontal going basically right the way across the back of her neck. In Ciara's case, also, we know that there was significant blood loss because she was still dressed, and there was significant staining of her clothes. We also know that these wounds then were part of the decomposition of the body, and for that reason, it was for that reason that Doctors Cook and Margolius said that they were done ante-mortem, so before the girls died. So obviously very violent injuries, very brutal injuries, but the fact that they were both, again, the similarities, the fact that they were both in the neck region, there were multiple cuts, will again be a point that the prosecution will point to and return to. And
Dr. Margolius said that she believed that Jane Rimmer had been dumped within 6 hours of being killed. There was a bit of a professional differences in the time elements, wasn't there, as far as whether they were killed right there, whether had they been killed somewhere else and moved, but either way, both bodies ended up in a very similar position. Dr Cook differed slightly in when they were getting down to the nitty-gritty of the positions of the blood and where it was positioned, and even the judge asked that question too, because apparently after death, what they call lividity, which is where the blood cools down and settles, they can tell by the colour of that how long it's been there. We did hear that Dr Margolius said within 6 hours.
Yes, that was her conclusion. She came to, but Dr Cook wouldn't or couldn't be as certain of that, which I mean could be a point that the defence pick up on when we resume next week. But once again, I don't think there's any real argument about the fact of when Jane was killed, because we know when she was last seen, and we have vision of the actual last moment she was last seen, or CCTV vision of it at least, and then wasn't obviously at that family gathering the following day. So a slight professional difference of opinion, but not one that's really going to make a huge amount of difference to the overall case, I don't think.
And we've previously heard that Ciara, there was a lot of blood pooled there, and so that it was quite possible that she had been killed where she was found.
I think it's almost certain that was the outcome. There was a lot of, we had heard previously, there was actually a layer of soil from underneath Ciara's body that was actually taken for sampling and testing as well. And so that was clearly the conclusion that the police or the detectives or the intuition that the detectives were working on as well, that's what's happened. And with evidence to come, we've heard a little bit about it, of the state of Ciara's clothing, particularly the shirt, and her bra had some blood staining on it as well. I'm sure that will be explored more fully as we go through some more forensic evidence next week.
Was there any further information in relation to Ciara's broken thumbnail?
There was some thing that tweaked my interest only when they were talking about fingernails decomposing as well, which the judge actually picked up on and asked Dr Cook, does that indeed happen? And he said, what did he say to me? Yes, they did. They can fall off. Yeah.
I mean, it can be part of the decomposition process, but what stood out to me was Dr Margolius' statement when she was referring to Ciara was that the other nails that she noticed were manicured. I mean, they were intact, and they were, I think, Barbara Galler referred to it in her opening statement as beautifully manicured. I mean, and so it was the broken thumbnail, which we really do know is really important. Did stand out to her at first blush, really, at the first real viewing of the body, and as we know, they paid particular attention to it, to take cuttings of those nails during the post-mortem, which we will hear so much more about in the weeks and months to come.
And I guess from a forensic sense, it does point to the fact that they are saying that these injuries, these various injuries, are unlikely to be old or for anything have been sitting there for any length of time. This is all very close to the time of death.
Yeah, correct, Matt. I mean, that is the conclusion that Dr Margolius reached, that Dr Cook agreed with, that because there were advanced states of decomposition around the wounds, which meant that they were open to the elements when the bodies were placed in the elements, if you know what I mean. They weren't done after, and they hadn't been done any significant time before. And they can tell that basically by the decomposition rates of the body.
Is that the end of the pathologists?
No, we have at least one more, and we'll be hearing her next week. Being a public holiday here with Australia Day on the Monday, they won't resume until Tuesday, and we will be able to report her findings as well. Then, of course, I think probably with them what have we got coming up after that? Some more forensic DNA stuff, or?
Yeah, we think that after that, so we've got more of Dr. Cook on Tuesday. He will also be cross-examined, which will be quite lengthy. Another Dr. Alana Buck, who is an anthropologist, but mainly in this process was examining bones. And then after that, we understand that we will get to Pathwest staff and operatives who were obviously involved in collection of and most importantly storage of exhibits, but then also movement of exhibits at various times over this vast timeline, including to overseas. And this is where the continuity evidence, potential contamination evidence will really start to be rolled out, and we anticipate the chief amongst those will be the chief at the time, Laurie Webb, who we've discussed previously. He transported the nails to the UK for when they were tested. He also had issues towards the end of his career, which led to him being dismissed from Pathwest in the mid 2010s. So it's going to be again a very interesting week, probably quite trying week for all of us, but it rolls on.
Yeah. And just the nature of the trial, we have to listen to all of this because it is the crux of the trial. It's they can't minimise anything, and of course the defence will then hone in on things too, and that's why the details are so explicit and graphic and biological.
I think there'll be great interest in this evidence that's coming up, particularly from Pathwest and Laurie Webb, and I think people will be listening to find out just how far that contamination, evidence goes.
Yeah, well, it's just, it is a defence hypothesis at the moment, Matt, so we haven't heard any evidence yet, but that is what they're working on or towards or suggesting on or towards, and so that is where this evidence will be going, and and whether it's proved one way or the other could be the tipping point on a verdict one way or the other.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for your time this week. That wraps up week 7 of the trial. For more information, head to thewest.com.au. We'll be back on Monday with a special episode remembering Sarah Spears, which is on the 24th anniversary of her disappearance. Join us then.
This podcast was produced by Kate Ryan and Alicia Preedy and recorded in the studios of 7 West Media. Audio files were provided from the archives of the 7 Network and the West Australian. Sign up for daily emails and all the latest on the Claremont trial at thewest.com.au.
Enjoying this podcast? If the story behind the headline matters to you, then you can count on thewest.com.au to deliver. For more on Claremont the trial, follow the live blog, watch the nightly news updates, and sign up for daily email updates at thewest.com.au. Subscribe now for just $1 a day at thewest.com.au.